The flight director says get back in.
This is Jim. What, got any message for us?
Jimmy Port, get back in.
Okay.
One less than one. One less than Earth glow, please wash me, cast me in starlight. Take these racing thoughts and give my heart flight. In your blue currents are every mother's hope. Billions live and die in your blue envelope.
It's second Saturday, 10 a.m. here, Mountain Standard Time. You, Korihors, get your to church.
There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known.
For a godless man, he could preach a hell of a sermon.
Reborn, universal, capable of change, with hands unburdened, lift a heart from pain. One less than one, one less than one less than the remainder, living soul. One less than one less than one less than set aside the self and wonder become. One less than one. One less than one.
We are on, ladies and gentlemen, with the one and only Dr. Thomas W. Murphy. Tom, how are you?
I am very well, Joe. It's great to join you on this show today. I'm coming from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, just north of the Seattle area.
Mhm. Is that where you were from originally?
I've been here since 1994, so I've been here for a few years. But I was born in Los Angeles, California, by parents from Idaho, and they moved back to Idaho when I was pretty young, and I grew up in southern Idaho.
Awesome. And that's interesting, southern Idaho. My family's from Cache Valley, and I've been talking all week with for a couple of weeks now with David Taylor, who's from the Nez Perce community, and so they're in Idaho. So it's like I'm talking about Idaho all the time lately. Do you ever get back there?
Oh yeah, I have family in the Cache Valley. I have family in the Preston area.
Okay.
Family in St. Anthony, Idaho Falls. Twin Falls, Boise, Haley, all sorts of places all over Idaho. Lots of family.
Cool. Yeah, my dad's from Lewiston, so like I hear about Preston all the time. He's like, yeah, that's where we would go. And so my dad watches Napoleon Dynamite and he gets homesick.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, one of my sisters is in a scene, kind of back scene from that. And my dad is now my stepmother runs the Arctic Circle, and my sister, they run the Arctic Circle there in Preston.
Oh man. You come from Mormon stock like me, man. That's pioneer stock right there. Your family come up with Brigham Young Jr. and that whole business.
Yeah, I have family that go all the way back to the early church time in New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois.
Oh wow, that is far back. We only go back to Nauvoo, the Rollinses. I asked my dad before we went on. I was looking at your picture while I was making the thumbnail. And I said, "Hey, do we got any Murphys in the clan?" I said, "This guy could pass for a Rollins." He's like, "Nope." I'm like, "Have you checked?" That was a Monty Python line. It's like, "You seem very sure. Have you checked?" Anyways.
Not that many Murphys in the Mormon tradition. It's an unusual name. My father was a convert to the church, so
okay.
My pioneer line is on my mother's side. And my father married into a prominent family in Preston in his second marriage. So
okay,
that's how he got into the Arctic Circle there.
Interesting. Now
And he ran the Arctic Circle in Rexburg too. So after that Teton flood in the 70s, he bought the Arctic Circle in Preston in Rexburg and ran that. So all these Rick's College graduates or alum and the BYU Idaho students now, that's family history there. That store is no longer in our family.
Yeah, the Arctic Circle. I don't know how widely they are franchised outside of the Mormon suspender, but that's a pretty Mormon thing. I remember going with Arctic Circle. Somebody says Arctic Circle, you go, you say it. Mormon?
Yeah.
Mormon or Exmo?
Yeah.
Yeah, the most interesting thing to go on my work with Arctic Circle is that's where Ted Bundy picked up one of his victims.
Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah, working at the Arctic Circle in Sandy, I think, or Murray, I think. Anyways,
well, that one's not in my family.
Okay, we wouldn't have blamed you if it was, Tom. Tell me, okay, so tell me a little bit about. We talked a little bit about you. That you are you started out an atheist in a foxhole, which, funny enough, was the first episode, one of the first episodes that I did specifically for the Church of Cory Hore here on Hellfire Agency. Was with Nathan Bigler, who's one of the founding directors of the Church of Cory Hore, and we talked about specifically. It says they capitalize on this out there in the apologetics world, that there are no atheists in foxholes. And he says, and I can tell you firsthand, it is not true. It's not true. So, but tell me about your experience.
Yeah. So, I do have this, I find your channel fascinating because I have this history of being an atheist in the foxhole and also using the pseudonym Cory Hore. And so you're intriguing that you're doing some similar things, a generation later. And so in my case, I grew up in the LDS church. And by the time I was pretty devout Mormon early on, right? Especially in the priesthood years, deacons quorum president, teachers quorum president, and I think they called it first assistant in the priest quorum or something like that. But when I was in the priest quorum was when I starting to question, and I was in a debate on a debate team for Pocatello High School, and in debate, for those who aren't familiar, you have to argue two sides of an issue, and so my black and white world got really gray. And I began to question everything, and that didn't bode well with the church. So by the time I graduated high school, I was pretty skeptical. I chose to get married young instead of going on a mission. I married Carrie Sumner, who was, I'm delighted to say, is still my wife 40 some years later.
Wow! Congrats.
So, we defied the odds. She was a student at Rick's College, and I was a high school student when we met. And that ended up working out, fortunately for me. But I was pretty skeptical, so I didn't go on a mission. I got married, like I said, And I also had a scholarship to Utah State University, so I accepted that scholarship and was studying at Utah State. And I didn't have a lot of money coming from my family, and so I needed to figure out how to pay for college. And I did have a scholarship, but I needed income, and so I was working a part-time job at McDonald's, and I decided to answer these recruiters that kept sending me messages or mail about joining the Army, right? The Army Reserve, National Guard. You can get $10,000 for college, they said. And so I joined the Army Reserve, and that was a mistake.
I was gonna say,
that $10,000,
go one of two ways from this point in this conversation. I think I know which one it's going in.
Yeah, that $10,000 ended up. I actually collected about 1,500 of it. So did not work out so well. I didn't read the fine print, But anyway, I was in the Army Reserve and later the National Guard, and by that time I'd switched. I dropped out of Utah State actually and gone to University of Iowa, and I dropped out in part because my wife Carrie was pregnant and due at the time I was supposed to go to basic training, and so she needed a place to stay. She was from Iowa, so we moved out to Iowa, and we could get help from her parents, right? And I was able to do basic training and my advanced training, and then I later enrolled at the University of Iowa, and it was there that I actually had switched from the Army Reserve to the National Guard to avoid a summer camp, so I could go to see my sister's wedding in the Cache Valley of all places. And that unit that I signed up in the National Guard just like a month or so later got called up, activated for the Persian Gulf War. And so I was activated there. And again, by this time I'd gone back to college. I started taking anthropology classes, and I had read a number of books, particularly about the Hoffman murder, Salamander Letter. I'd read Fawn Brody, and I'd heard No Man Knows My History. And I was starting to really question the even more so than I had in high school, question the church claims. And so
it's interesting, actually. I don't mean to cut you off, but it's interesting how many times I hear this story come up. I was in debate in high school because I was in debate in high school. And and it's like when you learned how to process, how to write out a work, in the Cory Hore argument in my book, I have written out in affirmative and negative. I have the whole debates between Cory Hore. I see them all as one debate. The Cory Hore between Cory Hore and Ammon, Yedona, and Alma, and flow chart out the way that Cory Hore maintains to the end. He maintains his position and then wins at the end. And so that's curious that you say that, because the whole thing, I don't mean to distract this off into, whatever anti-Mormon content, but the whole thing, I was fascinated to hear from Rob Lauer, because I consider myself a pretty good student of Mormon history, but not like Rob Lauer. I don't know if you know Rob Lauer, but he's
I know of him.
Yeah. So he says, Joseph Smith himself was a debate guy. He did debates.
Right. Yeah, he did. Yeah. Juvenile Debate Club. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, why is his position against Cory Hore sucks so badly then? And he reminded me, he's like, well, he's also Cory Hore. I'm like, that's true. That's an
interesting way to see it. Yeah. So when I got deployed to Saudi Arabia and Iraq, Kuwait, I defiantly called myself an atheist in a foxhole. It was like, if people said there were no such thing, I was damned and determined to show them there was. And so throughout the war, I was definitely identifying very clearly as an atheist. And I did for a number of years. It's over time, my position's moderated a bit, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But, I went through that strong atheist phase during the war. After the war, finished my degree at the University of Iowa, and I got a degree in anthropology and one in religion. And then I went to graduate school at the University of Washington in the Seattle area. And that's where I went through my Cory Hore phase.
Okay. This is Cory Hore.
Yes, Cory Hore.
Yeah.
And so you got to understand the context of, this was the mid-90s. Kennewick Man, this fossil, the skeleton, had been found in eastern Washington. And there was a big dispute in the courts between the tribes and a select group of anthropologists who wanted to study the skeleton. And the native people here called Kennewick Man the Ancient One. And so I was like caught up in these debates. One of my professors was writing professional arguments for the court cases and stuff. So we were very much in this discussion of repatriation and the idea that should human remains that are found by settlers go back to the tribes or not? I mean, who owns the remains of our ancestors, right? That was a central question that we were wrestling with. And I was torn around this question. Because I'd always seen, digging up human remains is not problematic the way I'd been raised. But I had actually, when I'd been a graduate or an undergraduate student at the University of Iowa, I had accidentally uncovered a human remain as part of an archaeological dig. And that's how I start my book, Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois and the Book of Mormon.
Is that out? That's officially out now on
it's officially in the warehouse and on its way to bookstores. You can, if you order it directly from the University of Utah Press, you can get a copy right away. I will be speaking at Benchmark Books in Salt Lake City on June 9th at 6 p.m. Cool. That's a Tuesday. And I hope to see some of your listeners there. We'll have copies and I'll be autographing them there. I will also be autographing them in Las Vegas during the Mormon History Association meeting. So if anybody's going to be there, it'd be a great time to meet me and get a copy. But anyway, I that's how I start out this book, is with that story of actually finding a human remain. And that human remains that I accidentally encountered as part of this archaeological dig were right near the site where Joseph Smith claimed to have found Zelf. This was a skeleton that he called a white Lamanite, right? And he claimed that it was Zelf was a follower of Onondagas. Onondagas is one of the central nations of the Iroquois. And so there's this kind of connection that he was positing between the Book of Mormon peoples and the Iroquois. And so for me wrestling with these issues in the mid 90s, I was trying, I would say that I was pretty immature. I was, a young graduate student. And one of my ways of dealing with this was with humor. And so I created this April Fool's prank. And this April Fool's prank I distributed via email. And this was back in the days when, this was long before the internet, right, as we know it today. I mean, we did have emails and we had listservs and we had message boards. Those were the places we were communicating in the 90s. And so I created this April Fool's fake news story and distributed it on Mormonal and LDS Net, which were these big distribution groups that I was an active participant in, along with a lot of other kind of questioning Mormon graduate students and scholars around the world. Mm-hmm. But it got a copy of it here actually, and I sent you one.
Yeah, I pulled it up right here.
Yeah, so the headline was Alma demands return of Book of Mormon. ALMA is an acronym for Association of Lamanite Mormon Activists. And according to this fake news story, ALMA, or the Association of Lamanite Mormon Activists, wanted the Book of Mormon, the gold plates, any other native artifacts that are associated with it. They want returned to to Indigenous peoples, and
Interesting.
particularly to the Iroquois, because that's the traditional lands where the Book of Mormon is said to have come from.
Wow.
So it was a prank. It got a lot of attention at the time. Got forwarded across the BYU Hawaii listserv, and that generated a lot of feedback. And some of it was hostile, angry, but some native scholars like Jane Hafen, for example, really kind of educated me a little bit about maybe some of my immaturity and how I might approach these issues more maturely. Jane Hafen has been.
You weren't
really
wrong. You weren't wrong in your criticism, maybe with the approach. You weren't winning.
Right.
You weren't winning hearts and minds with the approach. I see.
And Jane, way back then, was a bit of a mentor to me, and has been even much more recently. We did a volume together. Well, she was the editor. I wrote a chapter called Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. And Jane is a Taos Pueblo scholar, excellent, thoughtful elder now. And she has really helped me think more maturely and more respectfully about these issues. And it's in this book that I first published an article about Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people and the Book of Mormon. And I shared that article with you as well.
Yeah. And I started into reading it before I got swamped with work and internet drama and podcaster drama. And so I was like, oh my gosh. So, but what I did pick up is, and we've had this conversation now a few times now, is that it's interesting, the paradigm shift that I am experiencing right now, even because and I tell you candidly, I just got off a phone call with Steve Pinecker of Mormon Book Reviews, who I know you guys have known each other for years. And I told him, I said, you tried to connect me and tell me about Thomas Murphy, like right when we first became friends. And I dismissed it almost out of hand. And I want to apologize. And he's like, you did? And I'm like, no, shut up. What's going on? No, but I didn't feel like I dismissed you out of hand, mind you. It was as soon as I heard the brief summary, I'm like, no, I would have heard about that. I would have heard about that by now. If any of that were true, I'd have heard of it. I'd have heard about it from these sources. And it's only recently, after having these conversations with David Taylor and people in the background in that movement, which you have nothing to do with, I understand that. And listening to that, I go, wait a minute. Did I, Mr. Critical Thinking Man, dismiss out of hand that the whole narrative that I understand about early Mormonism is a white man's history of a white man's movement from white voices, and didn't even consider, nobody admitted the voices of Indigenous peoples into this story? Not the church, not critics, nobody. The scholarship is all on, what did the white voices record? And, and I felt embarrassed. I'm like, I don't think I really have given the chance to say, well, if Indigenous voices are not getting heard, it's because we're not listening, and we don't know how to listen. And so when you and I had that conversation last night, I'm like, and here's somebody who's had that paradigm shift. When I had this paradigm shift when I was like 12, 13, 14 years old, you've been in this, and this seems like that's a big part of your work is the paradigm shift.
Well, that paradigm shift, a big part of it goes back to Guatemala, and I understand you have some Guatemalan connections as well. Is that?
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm being told, is that I have been in communication with the possibility of connecting with some people in Guatemala that the same movement Phil Lane's group is working with.
Now, do you have Guatemalan family as well?
Oh, yes. So my family, I am Mexican American on my mother's side.
Okay. What part of Mexico?
So my family is actually that I've traced back in terms of begats is back to New Mexico, in the Ensenada, Santa Fe area. But then, of course, at least my grandmother's family go back deep into Mexico, and at least as far south as Mexico. I'm sure that it goes down to Guatemala area at some point. But my grandfather's history, but interestingly enough, they were French Jews who came over. And I don't know if you're familiar with the controversial crypto Jews story.
Yeah.
I mean, I that's probably where I first got into this paradigm shift for me, was when I started learning about crypto Jews of the High Sierra, and started getting into this history and seeing the name Maestas pop up again and again. Maestas. And I'm like, and that's my mother's maiden name. And I'm like, and I started looking into the history and come to find out we have this whole secret history of secret Jews who were running from the Inquisition. And so it was dangerous to be a Jew. And so, and nobody'd ever nobody said anything. Some families in New Mexico, they say that the story of the Jewishness of the family is passed mother to daughter, so that the men won't go to the bar and start running their mouth in the bar. They would keep the women involved. And another woman said that there's, in some families, they'll have one priest, they'll have one son of each generation who goes to study the priesthood. But that same son also studies to do the Jewish burial rituals, so that he can do that as well. And it's like all this story, it's like, who knows how much is true, right? History is like that. But then I read this article about all scholars have panned this as not even possible, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I mean, look at how much content there is. How could it possibly, and DNA evidence even, which I understand is how you take off from that story. And I'm like, there really is, it seems like not a universal academic bias, but there is a bias, it seems to me, to exclude the voices that don't fit the narrative about where people come from, and indigenous people especially,
Yeah, it's not just the LDS and the Bickertonite or the Church of Jesus Christ that are having trouble accepting some of the things that David Taylor is saying, especially about the authority of indigenous voices. It's also very common in ex-Mormon communities and scholarly communities as well. But when I was in Guatemala in the 1990s, I was doing research for an undergraduate research project, and I was working in an LDS ward, and I was, at least for that time, attending and being an active participant in that particular ward. And one of the ecclesiastical leaders in the ward was a big proponent of the Popol Vuh. And the Popol Vuh is a 16th century Quiché Maya text that he identified as one of the other scriptures from that Jesus was speaking about in 3rd Nephi. And that really kind of blew my mind, for one thing. Well, on one sense, I was looking at it in terms of the historical question, and I knew enough about archaeology to know that there was a big problem there, right? That we just don't have the archaeological support for Hebrew and Egyptian languages. We don't have the support for horses and steel and cattle and sheep and goats and so on. So archaeologically, there's a real serious problem with it. But I hadn't, before I got to Guatemala, I'd heard of the Popol Vuh, but I had not read it and had not studied it. I didn't know much about it. So that became my interest in this idea of other indigenous scriptures. Was introduced to me then. And I wrote a few articles back in the 90s about that. More recently, I revisited that work in the Journal of Mormon History in an article called An Insufficient Canon, the Popol Vuh, the Book of Mormon, and Other Scriptures. And look at that, what was happening there in the 1990s in Guatemala, when there was this strong Maya movement that was claiming the Popol Vuh as a scripture, an alternative to the Bible, you know, and a Native American scripture. And that sparked an interest in indigenous scriptures. While I was a student at the University of Iowa, I had read Black Elk Speaks, and that was also a text that was presented by a Dakota scholar by the name of Vine Deloria Jr. as a North American Bible of all tribes. So I was interested in reading the Book of Mormon in relationship to those. And my first round of my dissertation draft at the University of Washington, I called it Blank Pages and Scriptural Tombs. And it was going to be a comparative study of the Book of Mormon, Popol Vuh, and Black Elk Speaks. My committee pushed back, and they said I was really taking on too much. And they said, you know, to get the grounding that you need in Dakota studies and Maya studies and Mormon studies is quite a challenge, right? So they recommended I narrow the focus to just the Mormon stuff. And
how did you feel about that at the time, if you don't mind my asking? I mean, was that hard feedback for you?
It was both, you know, it was both humbling, you know, in a sense, oh, well, maybe you're biting off more than you can chew, but it was also very good advice because it made the job easier, right? It made the task much more achievable within a reasonable time frame. And so it was good advice. And so the dissertation I produced was called Imagining Lamanites, Native Americans in the Book of Mormon. And it looks at the way that Latter-day, actually the restoration movements more generally, have imagined indigenous people as Lamanites. Where those ideas come from in the 19th century before Joseph Smith, and how they've evolved over time. Well, one of my members of my dissertation committee by the name of Gary Witherspoon, who was a prominent anthropologist working with the Diné or Navajo people, while I was there, he was selected as BYU's Alum of the Year. He was the only Mormon on my dissertation committee. And he critiqued my dissertation for not addressing Iroquois connections to the Book of Mormon. And of course, he didn't ask me to actually do that work, but he said that I really overlooked it, and that was a flaw of my dissertation. And I had intended to do it. I just ran out of time, right? And again, it was the same problem that I had with dealing with the Popol Vuh and Black Elk Speaks. But he's, you know, saying we got the Code of Handsome Lakes got similarities in other native scripture, and I did discuss the Popol Vuh and Black Elk Speaks in just a little bit of detail, but it was only kind of the Mormon views, right? And so I had that lingering there. I'd hoped to address it. I purchased a copy of this fascinating dissertation that won an award from the John Whitmer Historical Association called Telling Stories About Mormons and Indians by Lori Taylor. And she was a graduate student in New York, studying under the Seneca scholar John Mohawk. And she had uncovered a fair number of stories about how Joseph Smith was influenced by followers of Handsome Lake. Handsome Lake was a prophet, a Seneca prophet from a generation earlier than Joseph Smith, not far away from Palmyra, New York. And so there are these similarities in time and place, and she explores these indigenous stories, allegations that Joseph Smith was influenced by indigenous peoples. And she concludes that the best candidate for actual interactions between Joseph Smith and followers of Handsome Lake was when the Seneca orator Red Jacket came to Palmyra, New York in 1822 and gave an address in the Palmyra Academy. And there's no record of the Smith family being there, but it's doubtful they weren't. And, because everybody in town was very interested in that. And with Joseph Smith's interest in indigenous peoples, it's pretty likely he was there.
And Palmyra was really not a big town, right? I mean, it was a little. It was really almost a Canadian town, frankly. It's like so. It's the way I described it, and I'm looking at it on a map. I described it in the Cory Hore argument. I'm like, if you've never heard of Palmyra, New York, it's because it's more Toronto than it is Albany. It's so far north, you know.
Yeah, and it's part of Seneca territory, right? So Seneca are one of the 6 nations of the Iroquois. So you have, and actually, this shirt is known as the Belt of Hiawatha, and it represents the Belt of Hiawatha, and it's the original 5 nations of the Iroquois represented here. You have Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas. Senecas were the keepers of the western door. Mohawks were the keepers of the eastern door. And the Tuscaroras, the 6th nation, would join later. Okay. And so Lori had done this really excellent work. She thought the stories really got their widespread popularity across indigenous communities in the United States and Canada because of a Tuscarora activist by the name of Wallace Mad Bear Anderson basically between the 1950s to the 80s. He was traveling far and wide, leading the American Indian Unity caravan. They stop in West Jordan, Utah, in the early 70s, and they stop at reservations all over the 2 nations, the U.S. and Canada, and he's sharing these stories about Mormons, and they get widespread. And so she attributes, at least he was, if he didn't invent the tale, he was at least a wide purveyor of it. And so I had purchased her dissertation, but not read it. Then my career ended up going a very different direction. I ended up doing the articles on DNA in the Book of Mormon that made me famous, showing that there wasn't any genetic evidence for the Book of Mormon.
Now, this was before or after Hugo Perigo's
Well, this was before. I was the first scholar to write a peer-reviewed article on DNA in the Book of Mormon.
Cool.
And so I did have a colleague by the name of Simon Southerton. He's a geneticist in Australia who'd written an Exiting from Mormonism story prior to my academic article. And he and I collaborated on some news articles and peer-reviewed articles later. And he wrote a book called Losing a Lost Tribe, published by Signature Books. So he wrote the first book on DNA in the Book of Mormon. I wrote the first article.
Interesting.
That was peer-reviewed anyway.
Okay, cool.
And it also became part of my dissertation when I dropped the other scripture stuff. I picked up the DNA stuff instead because I had been asked to write that article by Brent Metcalf, who was a great scholar of the Book of Mormon, or is a great scholar.
He is a great scholar, yeah. And Brent Metcalf is a legend, man.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so he and Dan Vogel published my article called Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics in an anthology called American Apocrypha. And that would almost get me excommunicated when that came out, because even though I wasn't actively going to church, I was by that time calling myself a Latter-day skeptic. And I got called in by my stake president, and he had a copy of that article from American Apocrypha on his desk. And he said that he actually read to me my own conclusion and said that, or a portion of my own conclusion, and he said that the church cannot accept a member who makes statements like you've made, that basically the Book of Mormon is a product of the 19th century, and that there is no genetic evidence to support the idea that ancient Israelites made it to the Americas during the time frame of the Book of Mormon.
What year was this?
This was 2002 when I first published it, or 2001 when I first published it. It was first came out in an online journal, and then the book came out in 2002. Came out in an online journal that's now defunct called Mormon Scripture Studies.
It is wild to consider. I don't mean to interrupt you, but it's just wild to consider that this rule, effectively, the what you're talking about is the very ruling by which I was excommunicated in 2013. To
Yeah.
consider that but I was a loudmouthed, armchair historian Exmo who was a little too belligerent, and apparently, according to some people, had moral issues, and so but you are a scholar doing scholarly work, and you're being told your membership is in danger because of because of scholastics. That's
Mhm.
that's mind-boggling, I think, to think to anybody. I mean, would that ever happen anywhere else? I mean, maybe it would, but that's a system. It feels like a system that's so controlling that I don't know that the church like that even exists right now. And and yet we hear people getting excommunicated. I mean, Landon, what's his name?
Brophy.
Brophy, thank you.
Yeah.
It's like, who is a more gentle and mild critic of the church than Landon? He's not trying to upset anybody, but here we are. It does feel like sometimes the church is so big and nebulous that we forget that it's local congregations. They may be afraid of losing members. They may be afraid of getting a bad image at the top of the church, but locally they're looking to kick apostates out, man. Some of them, anyways.
Well, I can thank Maxine Hanks, who was one of the September 6th, for helping me reverse or defeat the church's effort to excommunicate me. She told a reporter from the LA Times that Thomas Murphy was the Galileo of Mormonism.
Whoa.
The same reporter called me and asked me about it, and I'm like, that's a little overblown, and he didn't quote me saying anything like that, but he also called my stake president, and my stake president, he asked him what it was like to be the inquisitor, or the equivalent of the inquisitor. And my stake president, who is a local lawyer, prominent local lawyer, began to have second thoughts, and he called me the night before the story was going to come out in the LA Times and before my disciplinary council, and postponed it indefinitely at the time. And then later, a few months later, when Fox News was doing a sweeps week story about it, he called me back in and permanently halted the disciplinary actions.
Wow.
They haven't bothered me since, and I don't bother them either, I don't think so. I mean, some of them may be bothered by my scholarship, I suppose, but
you never know.
Yeah, I don't actively participate. I mean, when I'm visiting family and stuff, if there's a funeral or baptism or something like that, I'll come and participate. But that's about it for my involvement in the LDS church.
So I guess anybody would ask, at that time, and feel free to tell me, Joe, that's way too personal, F off or whatever you want to say. But at the time when you're going through this, do you believe in God? Do you have a testimony, as they say, about the book? Do you believe the Book of Mormon in any fashion at that point?
No, I mean, while I was doing all that research, I was still identifying myself as an atheist in a foxhole, right? But it started to shift over time, and I don't like have a set point in time where that shifted. I started using the term Latter-day Skeptic around the time that I was all in the news media, and I think that was even a headline in a news story, calling me a Latter-day Skeptic. I just like the play on words, instead of Latter-day Saint. I didn't think I was much of a saint, but I was a skeptic, and so I began to identify more that way. It wasn't that I rejected the atheism. It's just that I started to see myself more for what I do. I approach things skeptically than what I don't believe, right? And the other thing that started changing my point of view was my involvement in Indigenous communities. And that had started. I had grown up with stories of having Iroquois ancestors from a young age. So I always knew that there was some connection, but I didn't really explored in much depth other than, well, actually I did explore it. What I did is I explored it as I wanted to better understand indigenous perspectives of the Book of Mormon. So just given the opportunities that were present in the graduate program or the undergraduate program where I was at the University of Iowa, and then the graduate program at UW, is that I had a lot more opportunity to go to Latin America. And so on my family, I had these stories of Iroquois ancestry on my mother's side, but on my father's side, my grandfather had lived in Mexico as a child, in Oaxaca in southern Mexico, and my great grandparents, they had migrated to Mexico from Washington.
Oh.
And so I knew I had this Mexican connection in my family too. And these were not part of the Mormon colonies in Mexico, but it was similar. It was during the same time period as the Mormon colonies, but it was non-Mormons colonizing in Mexico. And so I took the opportunity to do Latin America stuff. At the time, people were talking about Mesoamerica is where the Book of Mormon happened,
Right.
And so there's this big Mesoamerican emphasis. So it made sense to go to Guatemala and Mexico rather than to Western New York. And so my field research that I did was in Guatemala and Mexico. In Mexico, I worked with Nahua community in central Mexico that had this fascinating story of a man by the name of Margarito Bautista, who was a Nahua theologian who wrote an entire book about the Book of Mormon called La Evolución de Mexico, or the Evolution of Mexico. And so I dove deep into his interpretations of the Book of Mormon. I learned from the Guatemalans about their connections with the Popol Vuh. And so I was really trying to better understand indigenous perspectives on the Book of Mormon, not through my own ancestors, but through other indigenous peoples, Nahua and Maya in particular. After I graduated, I got my degree, PhD. I was already working at Edmonds Community College in Western Washington. I'd been fortunate to get a job locally. My daughter could stay in a local high school. My wife had a job too, so I was able to stay in the same area that I'd gone to grad school. And I had a great job at Edmonds. I was invited to work a lot with local tribes. And I ended up developing an environmental anthropology field school, working closely with Coast Salish tribes that I done for about over 20 years now. And so I had a lot of time to spend with elders and learning from indigenous peoples. And Coast Salish peoples, which are the indigenous peoples of Western Washington, are, a canoe people, a salmon people. And so a lot of my work has been about bringing salmon back to the sites of the treaties, for example, very hands-on field-based work with the communities. I also took students on tribal canoe journey, and this is like traveling the ancestral pathways of the Salish Sea. So we would paddle as far as Bella Bella in British Columbia, like halfway to Alaska, 500 miles from where we're at, in tribal canoes with students and elders. And as I was living and working in indigenous communities, most of my students, for example, when I'm on a tribal canoe journey, were indigenous themselves. And so I was often invited to sweat lodges, pipe ceremonies, to family naming events, and a lot of ceremony and ritual in indigenous communities. And what's interesting, I never converted to indigenous beliefs, because you don't really convert. Okay. There's no such thing as converting. Maybe with some of the more Christianized versions of like the Native American Church, you might convert there, but even there, I think most people would talk about maybe being part of a lodge, right?
Right. It's curious that you say that, and I know that. And again, don't mean to interrupt you, but I find this so fascinating. I know I believe you watched my interview with Dr. Anton Treuer, right?
Yes, I did. Yes.
That's when I was starting to debunk Midegah. I was trying to point out, there's no way this guy's claims are true. And looking back, I'm a little embarrassed to admit that as I look back on it again, once again, this paradigm shift of looking at and saying how much of what I believed that were Midegah's claims were actually Shane Baldwin's claims, and sitting there next to him, and David Taylor would just shut up and let him talk, or he wasn't even there, and they were just talking for him. I'm like, holy crap! I was here doing this work, Dr. Treuer filling me in and educating me on not just tribal but on indigenous culture and how it works, and he taught me things that I didn't realize I was going to correct my own thinking on. But now looking back on it, I can see, and I had this conversation with David Taylor just a couple of days ago, where I said, I see now that I let a white man speak for you. I let a white man tell your story, and that is the problem. Goes all the way back to the Book of Mormon. And he's like, your eyes are being opened on this. And he's like, look, I don't expect you. He said to me, I don't want to reveal anything that's privileged here, but he held up a copy of the Popol Vuh, and he showed it to me. And he's like this. He said, do you think I have to believe that every word of this is true to continue my work and do my work? And he says, my job is to get the sacred records. My job is to bring them together and bring people and sit in a circle. My job is not to believe every word of it is gospel doctrine. That's you guys that believe that you have to do that. You can't be a part of it unless you believe it all the way completely true. He's like, I'm not obligated to believe anything. That doesn't make sense to me. And I was like, and he says, in our tradition, in indigenous communities, you bring people together and you sit in the circle and you let them speak. I'm paraphrasing this in my, once again, a white man speaking for an indigenous man, but he's not here. So I'm going to just, but that's the thing that fascinates me about what you're telling me right now, is because we can even see it in Christianity. It's like originally, if you go back to Christianity and its origins, this is an indigenous story of people who are indigenous to that area. And then I really feel like the Council of Nicaea and the ecumenical councils and the creeds and all this were meant to silence voices of the churches and unify into a central top-down authority that would fit better with expansion, with imperialism. And I mean, it's just to look at it and say, oh yeah, wherever they go, they try to silence indigenous voices and say, look, no, it's top-down authority. And here I am looking for how are people in the Heartlander world trying to create this top-down authority while I've got the people actually involved. I got one guy involved primarily in the middle of it going, I just let them talk. It doesn't mean that I agree with everything they say. And this isn't us. But, but his voice was being silenced. I mean, it's being overshadowed by white men. And so anyways, but where was I going with that?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned David Taylor because we actually have a mentor in common. So when I was starting this field school, there were several Native mentors who helped me get it going, but one of them was a man by the name of Phil Lane Jr. And he worked with another scholar by the name of, a filmmaker by the name of Phil Lucas as well. And Phil Lucas was Baha'i and mixed indigenous traditions with Baha'i traditions. And Phil Lane Jr. was at that time was the executive director of United Indians of All Tribes Foundation, and they maintain what's called the Daybreak Star Indian Cultural Center in Seattle. This is a location that Indian activists in the 70s took over Fort Lawton, a military fort during the Vietnam War. They invaded the military fort and took it over. And then negotiated a transfer of 20 acres of the park, of the fort, into what is now part of Discovery Park in the city of Seattle. And so he was the executive director there, and I was bringing students to Daybreak Star to help with his efforts to restore the land there. He had a whole team of people working there, and so he would, we were helping with this project, he would come out and welcome my students to Daybreak Star and share a little bit about his fourth world prophecies. And these are
This is
the
Phil Lane.
prophecy that, yeah, Phil Lane. Yeah.
Okay.
And so he was, he definitely saw the world in a way that that anticipated something similar to what we see in the Book of Mormon, of that there would be this restoration of indigenous peoples to leadership positions. And so there is like the prophesied fall of the United States, and the rise of, in the Book of Mormon, is the rise of Zion led by indigenous people, with the Gentiles playing a subordinate role, supporting the rise of these indigenous nations. So he's sharing these prophecies that are echoing, I'm like,
Sounds familiar.
That sounds familiar. And I don't think I ever talked to him about my connection to Mormonism, because that work that work with Coast Salish communities, I did not publicly identify in relationship to Mormonism. I was a anthropologist helping get students involved in local communities supporting indigenous programs and indigenous objectives. So I don't know that he was even aware that I had a connection to Mormonism.
It's interesting. Now I remember what it was. You made me remember what it was I was going to ask you. Because Dr. Treuer, he told me when I had asked him, I was trying to find out, there was a lot of a question at the time whether or not David Taylor was a pretendian, which is a term I learned from Dr. Treuer. I didn't even know that term existed, but people who are not of indigenous descent, but claim to be, as I understand it, because there are people who kind of get brought in from outside of the line, the family lines, as I understand it, but their process is different. But if you misrepresent yourself, you misrepresent your generations, and that as an indigenous person, those are the people that get specifically called out as a pretendian. And he said, Dr. Treuer said, look, I don't know who he is. He's like, I've never heard of him, and he's like, I'll just give you blunt answers. And but the wisdom that I got from him, he said, look, in our ceremonial worlds, in native ceremonial worlds, no tribe can say to another, no lodge, can say to another lodge, that's not the way you face in the ceremony. That's not the way you lay the branches in the ceremony. If that's the way your lodge does it, that's the way your lodge does it. And this is the way our lodge does it. And David Taylor, who, when I first brought him up in a video I'm now had to take down, at first he's like, he was like, that guy, Anton Treuer, blah, blah. And I defended him because I'm like, okay, you have your position. I'll let you say your piece. I have a lot of respect for this man. He really educated me. And he said and I told him that part. And that's when he said, well, that's true. And he says, what the part he doesn't say is, lodges were the center of the economic, the spiritual, the economic, and political, I think, world for indigenous communities. And he says, and the way I understand it is that's the world where Phil Lane is doing work, is he's working with lodges and working with people in their local spiritual traditions, more so than Bureau of Indian Affairs registry and things like this, where, and he says, and then I said, okay, but what about, you have this subject about lineal descent versus blood quantum and all that. And I says, blood quantum, it just seems to me like it's so racist and it's so wrong. He's like, we wouldn't have any of those things if it weren't for the governments of the United States and Canada and services and treaties that they don't honor half the time. This is me paraphrasing him probably very badly, by the way. But I just thought that was interesting. It's like, do you see that there is a difference between the ceremonial world of, I don't know how else to call it that, because it's not, I don't know if you call it religion, right? Is the lodges that people like Phil Lane and Wendy Phillips and David Taylor and these guys that they're working with, they don't really care about your status, a person's status with the Bureau of Indian Affairs or any of those entities. They're not interested in that. They're interested in the old way of saying, look, state your generations. And if we find somebody that we know that is known to us, then you're welcome to sit in our lodge. At least that's the way I understand it.
Yeah, I don't definitely am not an authority to speak on those questions about David Taylor in particular, and allegations of pretendianism. But I will say that my experiences in Coast Salish communities are very similar to what you've just described. So when we're traveling on tribal canoe journey, each stop along the journey, it's kind of like the Olympics. We go to a different location each year, and that location moves around. And so there's a final host nation that sets kind of the agenda and goal of the journey as a whole. Okay, when they're gonna welcome canoes to their land, and then there's these series of meetings that occur that I've participated in for a number of years, where the different nations come together, and each canoe family has the authority to kind of make their own decision. They're going to make their decision about, are they going to host, right? And there are limitations, right? Because where you're located and the timing of when the final nation is going to host largely dictates when you potentially might host. But you could host for 1 day, you could host for 2 days. There are decisions that, or you could team up with a neighboring nation and host together. There are a number of decisions that are made locally, right? So that along the route, those host nations have their own sovereignty, their own authority. And so if you have a certain way of doing things, let's say a particular direction that you travel during a dance, for example, or during a ceremony, those decisions are made on the basis of who the local host is, not based upon where you come from. I mean, there's latitude for the canoe families that are traveling to do their own thing, but how it's operated as how the protocol is carried out at that host nation, if there's a dispute about how it ought to be done, it's the host nation that determines what's going to happen. Because
they defer to the host
their traditions. And I've been in those arguments with the traditional chiefs, arguing with each other. Okay, this is the way it should be, this is the way it should be. And then somebody says, okay, but here's the way we do it here. And there's, okay, if that's the way it is done here, we're fine with it. And there's this deference to that local authority. So, those aren't lodges, those are canoe families.
Okay.
But there are, I also participated in a number of sweat lodges, and these are run very differently. Depending on who's running the sweat lodges. I've not participated in Midegah lodges,
okay.
And so I don't have any direct experience of that. But I've read a little bit about them, and they're fascinating. Mm-hmm. And there certainly are reasons, even for a skeptical scholar like me, to expect similarities between Mormonism and Midegah lodges. And so this is kind of where people who are quick to dismiss David Taylor, I'm like, wait a minute, there are actually by the time that Joseph Smith comes on the scene in Western New York, he moves there from New Hampshire, right, and Vermont area in the 1816-17. By that time, and he spends his 1820s is when his ideas are developing and stuff. By that time, the Senecas had more than 200 years of interactions with Christians. They had been interacting with Catholic and with Protestant missionaries for 200 years. And they had been adapting their traditions to meet colonial pressures, to address concerns. Also, they saw things they liked, and they wanted to bring them into their traditions. And this is very important, and a big point I make in my book with Mormonism being the case study, is that Christianity in the Americas changed too in response to indigenous traditions.
Interesting.
And just to give you a case in point, we talk about Joseph Smith's first vision as kind of a founding story of Mormonism. Vision quests are an indigenous tradition of the Americas that was adopted by the settlers. Particularly, it was adopted in response to an issue that comes up repeatedly in the Book of Mormon, and that is that indigenous people seem to have a greater witness of the Creator, or of Jesus in the case of the Book of Mormon as well. That they're having these spiritual encounters that the more skeptical world of the 18th century, 19th century Enlightenment was poo-pooing the dreams and visions as something that is we don't do anymore. They might have done that back in the Bible days, but that's not something that informed educated Christians do today. And yet there was a pushback. There were these great awakenings where European Christians were adapting European Christianity to be more like indigenous traditions. And one of the ways they did that is by imitating vision quests. And so this was a big hot topic at Moore's Indian Charity School when Hiram, Joseph Smith's older brother, was a student there.
And his tutor.
And there's this big phase of going out and having these vision quests. And among the people who were having vision quests was Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack.
Really?
Parents.
Yeah, you hear stories about. I remember hearing the story about like the Lehi's vision, for example, is almost certainly taken from this vision that Joseph Sr. had. But then you hear this story about Joseph Sr. and the receiving from his father the Age of Reason, which is now, by the way, scripture at the Church of Cory Hore, Canada. And maybe I've been saying recently, ever since I learned that Dan Vogel took this position up, learned that from Kobe Reddish. And I'm like, oh, really? I don't think I knew that. When I wrote the Korihor argument and started the Church of Korihor, and he's like, that's Thomas Paine, right? And I'm like, well, boy, is it ever. And he's like, no, literally Korihor is Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how did I not see that? But then you and I had that conversation, and you enlightened me to yet another interpretation of that. You mind telling us?
Well, I would agree that the Korihor character resembles Thomas Paine. I mean, there's no doubt about it. To me, I mean, it's just obvious as can be. And the Age of Reason is the classic example. So the Age of Reason is a critique of the Bible, right? And a critique of Christianity, actually of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, of religions of revelation. Okay. And so there is a particularly influential discussion of this occurring in Palmyra and in the New York area, closer in time to Joseph Smith. And that is the Seneca orator Red Jacket I mentioned before. I
had no idea who this is. I had no idea about this.
Yeah, Red Jacket was one of the most famous Native Americans of that time frame. I mean, he was just he was a household name, right? And particularly because of a speech he gave in 1805 called A Response to Reverend Cram. Have you ever heard that cramming it down your throat? Right? Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, this is a phrase that comes from this Reverend.
No way.
Huh. Well, I mean, it's built into our language.
Wow.
And so Reverend Cram was trying to get permission to preach on one of the Seneca reservations, and Red Jacket was the spokesperson for the women. It was the women that would make that decision, and they directed him to not to allow Reverend Cram to speak or to proselytize. And so he gives this big response, and he said, basically we all have religion according to our own understanding. That theme comes out in the Book of Mormon. religion according to our own understanding, right?
Oh my God.
Okay.
Sure.
So he says, we have our traditions, you have yours. Okay. And the Great Spirit saw to it to give us ours in the form of ceremony and ritual and so on. He gave you yours in the form of a book. If he had wanted, if the Creator had wanted to give us our religion in the form of a book, he would have done so, but he did not. And so I think that Joseph Smith's production of a book is in part an answer to Red Jacket as well. And so we could think of Cory Hore as Thomas Paine wearing a red jacket, you know.
Love it. And
I think
very rebel without a cause. I love it. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, you do see that Joseph Smith, a lot of the characters of the Book of Mormon are these composite mixtures of people from the 18th and 19th century. That's a major theme that I go through in my book. In my book, I identify who, you know, like some of them are. It should be obvious. Like you heard of King Benjamin. Well, there's a famous line of Mohegan leaders by the name of Benjamin Uncas. And so this was another household name at the time, was Uncas and Benjamin Uncas. And so you have this character, Benjamin Uncas. There's 3 generations named Benjamin Uncas, and they have a son named Isaiah Uncas. Okay, so you have King Benjamin and Mosiah, who's kind of a mixture of Moses and Isaiah. And they have a big, very public dispute that ends up with kind of a decision by the council of whether or not they should have authority by what they would call kings. They would call King Benjamin Uncas, they'd call them kings. But that wasn't the indigenous term. That was the settlers' term. They called them kings. And actually, they were kind of imposed by the state of Connecticut, or the colony of Connecticut, onto the Mohegan people. And so a man by the name of Samson Occam, who was a preacher there, or Occam, excuse me. Samson Occam was a preacher at one of the Mohegan villages, and he was asked to challenge the Connecticut authority. And so you get this challenge between a monarchy and a democratic way of organizing things. So there's a similar break that you see in the Benjamin Mosiah relationship in the Book of Mormon between kind of aristocracy and democracy. You see a similar break in the Benjamin Uncas, Isaiah Uncas family, and the key character leading that is a man by the name of Samson Occam, who Samson is a lot like Samuel the Lamanite, and in fact he would go preaching. Samson Occam would go preaching through Western New York, and so was well known very locally as well. He was kind of a generation before Joseph Smith, but his kind of approach was taken up by the younger generation, a Pequot minister by the name of William Apis. And William Apis in the 1820s was doing the same thing Samson Occam was doing, preaching in Western New York. And so what I do in the book is kind of look at how the indigenous people of Joseph Smith's world are caricatured,
yeah.
In the Book of Mormon, and you know, and there's a whole bunch of those, and
because you hear, for example, and I recently was going through some of your videos while I was doing other things, and I heard you say a thing that perked my ears up and say, you know, people talk about Hiram going away to Dartmouth College.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't Dartmouth College. It was Moore's Charity School. Okay, whatever it was called. And then
Moore's Indian Charity School is, if you look at the attendance records, that's the name used on the attendance records. Moore's Indian Charity School.
Which is so interesting. Which is what I'm like, okay, I'm like Mr. Debunked Joseph Smith guy, and I didn't know that. And so I was stunned. I'm like, and when you said, well, correct me if I'm wrong. You said this is a mission school. This is a school about a mission to the Native Americans, to the indigenous
Ye-
peoples.
Yeah, and this is where, so in all that work I was doing with Coast Salish people, I really gained a great appreciation for what we call indigenous ways of knowing. And see, indigenous people know their own histories. Okay, they know their families, they know where they come from, and they also have very incredible knowledge of the natural world. And so, I was doing a lot of work with with salmon and with wildlife. For example, working with elders and professional biologists on tracking animals. So I'm actually a certified wildlife tracker, using
Whoa.
a combination of the best of Western science and indigenous knowledge that I learned from elders, of how to identify animal tracks and sign, and use that information. We use it to help monitor road construction projects and how to create green spaces within cities, how to connect them to each other. So we're using this indigenous knowledge along with Western science together to solve modern problems. As I had that appreciation for indigenous knowledge, then I come back and reread Laurie Taylor's dissertation about this indigenous knowledge of a connection with Joseph Smith. I no longer could easily dismiss it, because I'd seen so many times that even like memories way back of flood events that remember basically the end of the ice ages, right? If Native people can remember back to the end of the ice ages in their stories, they should be able to remember back to 1820s.
Mm-hmm.
And so those stories that Laurie Taylor collected are saying that the followers of Handsome Lake are tutoring Joseph Smith.
Mm-hmm.
And so I, of course, have been working now for several years in through the Conference of Iroquois Research and talking with scholars there, and I still hear these same stories. The same stories are repeated. That, oh yeah, we've always known that Joseph Smith had connections with our people, and that he stole our stories. There's different versions of it. He stole our stories. There's collaborative versions. They say that they shared the stories with him in an effort to create kind of a settler equivalent to the Code of Handsome Lake. That the Book of Mormon is basically the version for European audience, and the Code of Handsome Lake is the version for Haudenosaunee or Iroquois peoples, and so that you basically have two scriptures, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
That
mouth of two witnesses
were meant to be created together, and so what led me to come back to this topic was that great appreciation for indigenous knowledge, and I wanted to know for myself. I wanted to know my own family's history, and in fact, one of the elders, another elder, a Samish elder, who recently passed, so I'm not supposed to say her name, but she was a really important mentor to me, and I talked with her about these stories that I had been raised with of having Iroquois ancestors in my family tree, and she said, you really need to learn those stories. Your ancestors are trying to speak through you, and here I am, a skeptic. Okay, yeah, my ancestors speak through me.
The atheist in the foxhole.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't know about that, but I could see the metaphor in it. I could see the value in it. This is a really powerful teaching, right? And I remember hearing she would say when we're on journey, she would say that the songs we're singing are the voices of the ancestors.
Wow.
And in a sense, it is, right? It doesn't take these songs that have been passed down over generations are the voices of the ancestors. They're being recreated with our vocal cords, right? But they are the voices of our ancestors. So
the same genes that made one generation of cells in the bodies of those people are the genes that are remaking every cell in the body of everybody, of all their descendants now. right?
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
very literally, many of them are the words or the vocals in some cases, because not all these songs have words, but they're the sounds, and in some cases the words of the ancestors, and some of them, some of the songs, people will say they came to me. That is like a revelation, right?
mhm,
Another
mhm,
idea that uh, American Christianity adopts and Mormonism becomes an exemplar of. This whole idea of continuing revelation is very much an indigenous idea
mhm,
that's at the foundation of Mormonism. You wouldn't have Mormonism without continuing revelation.
mhm,
Well, the Protestants didn't have continuing revelation, right? It was indigenous people that did,
mhm.
and dreams and visions were one mechanism for that to occur.
It feels almost like a Gnostic kind of thing, right? I mean, it's like this whole way of knowing thing it feels very similar to the Christian the I think and sadly lost tradition of that this idea that the teachings of Jesus or the teachings of the wise Father, the wise God, or Sophia, all of this, they're not in books. They're in these moments of contact with the Holy Spirit.
Mhm.
Almost seems like not that it's the same thing, but these are two different locales on the globe that are trying to achieve the same thing, reach the same thing. Is that wild?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I don't know as much about the Gnostic stuff as I do
Okay.
the Indigenous American stuff, but I will say that it is. I've certainly worked in places where people say, "Yeah, some knowledge has been lost over time," but we can use the same mechanisms that our ancestors did to recover that knowledge. For example, the trees are our teachers, the animals are our teachers, and it isn't just that the gnosis, that it's not just the knowledge that's being passed on; it's the ways of knowing
Mhm.
that are being passed on. So paying attention to how a tree changes over time, or how an animal moves through space in the air or in the water, these techniques are part of that way of knowing that we can recover knowledge that's been lost.
Mm. Now,
And
as I understand it, the ways of knowing, I may be screwing this up entirely. In the Algonquin language of the Ojibwe, that is what Midday is, right? Or Midday when it is their ways of knowing. Is that not right?
I don't know if that's a
Okay.
direct translation, but the uh, that would be a good translation for something like religion, right? Ways of knowing, a way of life, because
Okay.
there isn't really a separate concept of religion in traditional Native societies. That's something that came along with colonialism.
Right.
But in
So,
to go back to answering your very earlier question
mm,
about how do my beliefs change? Well, kind of with that question of God, if you go back to, like, as I do in my book, the Seneca linguists of the 1820s, as they're translating the term Great Spirit, which is the term you see in the Book of Mormon, right?
mhm.
Uh, an alternative translation of Great Spirit is the Great Mystery,
Hmm.
and I really like that idea of the Great Mystery. That's very appealing to me because it does not require a belief in an entity, it doesn't require a belief in a being, and in fact, another important Ojibwe scholar, Gerald Wisner, he says, the trickster, the trickster creator is not a real entity. That's a colonial idea. It,
Huh.
it's more of an allegory. It's like more of a metaphor.
Huh.
And so, indigenous traditions don't require you to believe in a grandpa in heaven, right, or a father in heaven in that sense.
Right.
Although they will use the term grandfathers to describe the thunderers, okay, but the grandfather is like it's establishing a kin relationship between us and the thunderers, and thunderers are more powerful than us. That's for one thing. They've been around a lot longer than us.
I see.
And they are ecological forces that exist independent of the names we give them, right?
Mhm.
So I just found in indigenous traditions, you don't need to be atheist or a theist. There's a great mystery.
Hmm.
There are things that we don't understand. So that's, I guess, more agnostic, you could say. You could call that agnostic.
Yeah.
But I find that compelling. I don't necessarily believe it, because you don't have to believe it. And nobody ever nobody ever asks when I've been participating in native ceremonies whether you believe it or not.
Right. Do you believe that so and so was the original voice of the
No.
Great Spirit? Do you
Or-
have a testimony of the blow? Nothing of that.
No, and they say pray in your own way, do it your way. Whatever it means to you, that works. There's this freedom that you just don't see in. That's one thing that didn't get transferred apparently to Joseph Smith. Although there are some suggestions of even Joseph Smith's own doubt that I explore a bit in the Book of Mormon. There are passages that my good friend and scholar Jared Hickman likes to point out, that the Book of Mormon describes it as if the dead could speak.
Mm.
So if you read the Book of Mormon narrative carefully, there's a confession there that these words are coming as if the dead could speak. Joseph Smith is having these experiences as if the dead could speak. Well, we know the dead. Well, I don't know whether we can say they speak or not, but as if they could. And if they could, then Joseph Smith is channeling them, right? And he's getting his stories from the dead is the way he presents it to his followers. The way the Haudenosaunee people present it is that Joseph Smith got his stories from the living.
Interesting.
And so that's what I explore in the book. Evidence both for and against these stories. I share ones that are public. I've heard many that are not public, but I share and discuss ones that have already been released publicly. And bring forward those living indigenous voices to challenge those of us that are part of settler communities. And even though I have some very distant Mohawk ancestry, that doesn't make me indigenous. Okay,
It's curious. Yeah, it's interesting that you're saying that, because obviously, having started a church for atheists and agnostics, right? I get this question all the time, and it's like, especially from atheists. Atheists, we like to eat each other quite a lot, and we don't have meetings usually. We don't coordinate our activities. And so Stephen Pinecker, our mutual friend, has said to me and said many times, atheism, because he is an ex-atheist, and he says, atheism really is a reaction to church hurt. It is a way of healing, and most of them get angry, but their anger, atheists get angry because of that church hurt, and you have to have that time. Well, that's to be angry. And that was his experience. That was my experience. It's very much reflective of my experience. I'm curious about your experience when you go in pursuit of this, of discovering how your ancestors might speak through you individually. Is it purely academic? I mean, what's the personal motive for you? And do you feel like your perspective of atheist spirituality changes in that makes a transition at that time when you go looking for this?
Well, I'm pretty skeptical still. So I don't think the ancestors have a lot of options for how to speak.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Fair enough.
I'm one of those. But there are others, right? I mean, you could find their voices in the archives, which I did, which is pretty amazing. I found stories of my ancestors in the archives. So that was really cool.
Yeah.
And that's a part of the book as well. And so there are ways that the ancestors can speak metaphorically today, right? But they're pretty limited, and my voice is one of those limited options that they have. Now, certainly, a lot of people that I know that in Indigenous communities see the ancestors more vibrantly than I do, right? As more present.
Okay.
Although I'm a little bit comfortable with that, because to me, language is symbols, right? It's ways of describing the world, and the language that we use is never precisely accurate, right? And so if a theist is explaining something in terms of God and the devil, an atheist might speak in terms of good and bad, okay, but they're still wrestling with. I think there are good things and bad things in the world, right? And there is just different way of labeling, different way of understanding it. And so, as a cultural anthropologist, I have a lot of respect for different ways of understanding the world, seeing that I'm a bit of a cultural relativist in that sense. So I have no problem with people that say more literally the ancestor spoke in my ear, right? Or that it might be the bumblebee that was on my shoulder is the ancestor speaking to me, right? I hear those sorts of things. And I have no reason to debunk or belittle that way of thinking. It's just their way of thinking.
Your belief doesn't require you to debunk their belief. Is that about right?
No, and I think that's important too in approaching the Book of Mormon. I definitely approach the Book of Mormon as a 19th century document. Okay, and I explain a lot of the evidence for that. Okay, so the book is valuable in that sense if you want to understand the Book of Mormon within its 19th century context. But it's not a debunking of the Book of Mormon. I'm not bashing it. I'm trying to understand it within the context of an intercultural dialogue that's occurring in 1820s Western New York between indigenous people, primarily Haudenosaunee or Iroquoian and Algonquian. There are a number of Algonquian peoples as well. So those are two different language groups, right? And so,
okay, I didn't know that.
The Algonquians would
woefully
include the Anishinaabe. Yeah, they would include the Anishinaabe. And I should just say, it was worth pointing out that the Smith family had some strong connections to the Anishinaabe communities too. Okay, so that's actually the Mack family that did. Okay,
really?
So Stephen Mack Jr., who is Hiram and Joseph's cousin, he was also a student at Moore's Indian Charity School at the same time, and the two of them had about a half a dozen or so indigenous classmates that they were taking class with. They were almost definitely friends with, and some of them would go to Western New York same time they do, right? One of them was probably the interpreter when Red Jacket was speaking in Palmyra, a man by the name of Jacob Jameson. And so they have these connections. Well, Stephen Mack Jr., his dad is prominent in the fur trade. Stephen Mack Sr. Stephen Mack Sr. is one of the founding families of Detroit, Michigan. And they're quite heavily involved in the fur trade there. Stephen Mack Jr. marries a Ho-Chunk woman. She's a Ho-Chunk, or known as the Winnebago is another term used for the Ho-Chunk people. They're another Algonquian community. So they actually intermarry in the 1820s. And then when Mormons are later in Nauvoo, they're interacting with the Winnebagos, with the Ho-Chunks and the Potawatomi, so Honanaga, who is Stephen Mack Jr.'s wife, this Ho-Chunk woman, she's got part Potawatomi and part Ho-Chunk or Winnebago, and they founded a community in kind of along the Illinois-Wisconsin border. It's called Rockton. It's near Rockford. And there's like a Mac Forest, the Hananaga Forest. There's a Mactown Living History. My wife Carrie and I went last year and visited the community. And there's this pride and memory of this intercultural family and their connection, not just their connection between the settlers and the indigenous people of that Illinois, Wisconsin area, but also with Mormons. And they have a good memory of those Mormon connections. And when you read Hiram's biography, you're seeing that Hiram is traveling through Michigan and Wisconsin, Illinois, and almost doubtedly he's connecting with family along that route, and one of the reasons I think that the Potawatomi and the Winnebago were so friendly to Joseph Smith in Nauvoo was because of that Mac family connection, and how much information. So the Midewewin traditions go through an evolution in the 18th century, where you have this kind of coming together of Christian, Masonic, and indigenous traditions. So definitely a lot of the Midewewin traditions are ancient, okay? But there's also this infusion and this blending of Judeo-Christian ideas, and particularly Masonic ideas, into the Midewewin lodges, or even the term.
No way. That's so fascinating you would bring that up. I hate to interrupt you because you're on a good roll here, but we were all shocked, those of us who were live with Midegah on Sunday. Yeah. And he says, those symbols they have on the temple, on the veil and on the garment, those are Midewewin symbols. They're, and I interrupted him at that point to say, but they're also Masonic. I mean, they're clearly from Masonry. And he's like, no, they're ours. And but even he, acknowledges, and this is probably one of the more interesting things I think I'm picking up on here with you is, we have oral traditions, and I've dealt a lot talking about that in the Jesus mythicist realm, which is part of my more controversial content. Yeah. Is this idea of Jesus? The Gospels were, the defense of the Gospels is that they are oral traditions, and that you can see that in the way that they're constructed. But our criticism is, part of that is they change, they vary from each other. And over time, and then you have these divergent copies of it, but it's very clear that as your version of the gospel travels, it picks up the traditions of the local area. That's how you get dying and rising gods emerging in a Jewish cult, and they're like, "No, that's crazy. That's lunatic stuff. What are you talking about?" But at the same time, I'm like, okay, I look at the cognate over here. My friend Richard Carrier, who uses Mormons as part of that description, he's like you have an angelic visitor coming to Earth, and he delivers these plates, and I look at it and say, no. How many? When I was looking into debunking Midegah at first, I was really debunking Zion Media, the YouTube channel where he was on. Which is evolved into a whole new thing. Are you familiar with the Zion Media controversy?
No, but I'm familiar with your self-critique here, and I think you're spot on with your self-critique here.
Okay, cool. But they started doing this. I've been fascinated with it, especially with the Church of Cory Hore, talking about how I don't believe anything that they're saying, but I recognize the need for more scripture. And that's what the Restoration movement was about originally, and that's why it was hot and exciting in the 19th century. And now it's gone stagnant. They want more, and they'll take it from wherever they can get it. You look all across the Mormon spectrum. These Mormons, they're losing Mormons. We see it more and more. The numbers are looking increasingly like there may be but 1 million people who actively practice Mormonism in the world right now. You have people leaving, and a lot of them are just feeling spiritually empty. And so, of course, once again, as it happened when Mormonism cropped up to begin with, you have prophets coming up. Shane Baldwin just yesterday gave a revelation on YouTube, just read out a revelation he received. And at the top of the revelation says received in the Bat Cave, which means it's in his basement of his house. And he reads off this revelation almost exactly like a Joseph Smith revelation. And I'm like, this is how it happens. The spiritual hunger is there. But while they're doing it, they're looking for it, for the connections that validate Midegah's claims, which at that time was mainly your stories are our stories. The Book of Mormon stories are in our traditions, and you don't acknowledge that, and your church doesn't acknowledge that. And then they go in and fill it. They would go in and fill it in with the rest of this. I don't know how closely. I do know some inside baseball about how closely related he is to them, which feels to me like they have distanced quite a lot. But the curious thing is they had this whole Book of Mormon conference. They brought out like the Michigan relics and stuff like this, right? I'm sure you're familiar with the Michigan relics.
With those rods, yeah.
And it's like, and I'm like looking at this, and I'm like, there's no way this is one Google search, friends, Michigan relics, and you got the story on Michigan relics, right?
Yeah, I mean, even James Talmage debunked those, right?
That's right. That ultimately it was even the church wanted it. The church wanted to
They owned
validate
it for a while.
Yeah, that's right. They had possession of it and then gave it back. Do you think James E. Talmage would have given it back if he thought these were real proof of the Book of Mormon? They'd either have it in the museum or they'd have it in the vault.
Yeah.
Give it back.
Well, let me give a little qualification what I said earlier. So when I said there's in 18th century Medewiwan traditions, there's this fusion of Christianity, indigenous traditions, and Masonry. It is not a one-way street. Okay, it's not just indigenous people bringing in Masonic and Christian elements. It's also Christians and Masons bringing in indigenous elements. Okay, and so what we get in American Masonry and even in Scottish, because people were traveling back and forth. So I mean, like Joseph Brant, John Norton, these are really key Masons. Red Jacket was a Mason. Okay.
Oh, it is really.
And so they're traveling back and forth to Scotland and England and exchanging information. So I'm not an expert on all of that history, but I know enough to say that there is an indigenous influence on Masonry as it exists long before 1820s, long before Joseph Smith came along. Okay, so to say where those particular symbols came from, I think I would need more research to know that.
Right.
And I haven't taken on that book project yet. But
you're welcome.
What I will say is there's enough there to not dismiss it out of hand. And there's enough there that it's worth the time of scholars to investigate. What are the indigenous influences on Freemasonry, as well as the indigenous influences on Christianity and Mormonism?
Because my understanding was that the mark of the compass and the mark of the square, that goes back to ancient
Masons,
Freemasonry. That goes back to like Knights Templar and stuff, I think, isn't it?
That's my understanding too. But what I will say is that I don't know enough to say that with confidence. And I do know from the literature I have read that information was traveling both directions. And where I do know really well, those 1820s Haudenosaunee and kind of proto-Mormon communities, that there was two directions occurring there too. They were influencing each other. And so the religion of Handsome Lake does look a lot like Quakers and like Mormons because of they're coming from the same place, same time. There was adoption of Christian concepts, but there was also by Quakers and by Mormons adoption of indigenous ideas. And we often forget that. And that what this book does is remind people of what are those indigenous roots of American Christianity more generally, but Mormonism specifically.
Yeah, see, I was watching their conference. They had a conference for like 3 days in somewhere in the Midwest. And I was watching it and just like commenting, doing my keyboard warrior thing. I still have healing to do. I'll take that. It was last year, and I've grown up a lot since then. I was in there. I'm like, okay, and they're asking questions like, here you have this ancient, you have this scroll, or you have this tapestry, you have this image of, that very clearly says this story that is from Christianity right here in this Indian tradition. What else could that possibly be? Or some kind of reference to the Old Testament. What else could that be but proof that these indigenous communities came from Jerusalem 600 years BCE? And I'm the guys in here that there were Catholic and Protestant missionaries for 250 years before America was a country. But I mean, it seems to me from an anthropology perspective, not only is that not surprising, it's not even controversial. This is how these things happen. This is how traditions evolve over time, and there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Yeah. The Mohawk scholar Darren Bonaparte, who I draw heavily from in my book, and he wrote an endorsement on the back and read chapters and the whole thing, and provided constructive feedback. And what he describes Haudenosaunee tradition as a living history, as an oral tradition that gets captured at different moments in time. And I go back through that literary record of how it changes over time. And what we find are the stories in the Book of Mormon fit really neatly with the versions that were present in the 1820s in Western New York, in the communities closest to Joseph Smith. And so that tells us something quite significant, right? Because those stories change over time, but they're a living history. And Darren Bonaparte describes it as, kind of, as they evolve by going back to older traditions, by incorporating into the founding of the Iroquois League, which is one of the narratives that makes it into the Book of Mormon. The great piece of the Book of Mormon is based upon the Iroquois Great Law piece. Well, that story, as it evolves, draws from Anishinaabe traditions, for one, and or Algonquian traditions, I should say more generally, and it also draws from the creation narratives within the Haudenosaunee oral tradition. So they're re-understanding things in their own terms. I mean, there's a great story I quote in the book of this transition from a trickster to a Messiah. Okay, and so you get a Messiah character in the Book of Mormon, right, rather than the trickster. So the older stories have more trickster-like characters that are kind of a mixture of good and evil. They are playful. They are fools. They make mistakes. They're bumbling fools, kind of. You have these trickster characters become more Christ-like. And one of the stories says, I that used to be the trickster am now the Messiah. It has to explain it to the listeners because they can see the change occurring in real time, right? And so the story itself explains its own changes. And so it's very much a living history. It's very much a two-way street, and it's a conversation. And this is what's, when we read the Book of Mormon by itself and we don't read these other sacred records, that then we're missing the other part of the conversation. And to give you an illustrative point of how misunderstandings happen is in my work with the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh is like the 16th century Quiché manuscript produced by scholars working under a Dominican friar, Domingo Vico. And Domingo Vico came from an analogical theological background. So when they're incorporating stories of Sinai or Babylon or floods and creation, they're doing it analogously. Okay, in that Sinai could be a mountain, but it could also be a cave. So in the Popol Vuh, the equivalent, and its related text, the title of Totonicapon, the Sinai are caves. Okay, we're in the Book of Mormon. So it's an analogy. It's like finding similarities through analogy, not through not being derivative. And so if you start to see that's what's happening with Handsome Lake, and that's what's happening with the Midegah traditions, there's a lot of analogy that then when people like Zion Media get a hold of it, they see those analogies as literal rather than analogous, rather than metaphorical, rather than allegorical. But in indigenous traditions, the allegory, the metaphor, the analogy, those are very common. And they were common in especially Dominican thought in the 16th, 17th centuries. And then the Jesuits come along and they're more skeptical. And the Jesuits are challenging the Franciscans, who are taking some of this stuff literally. And I go into kind of that debate as well in one of the chapters in my book, of how that is happening in Haudenosaunee communities long before the Book of Mormon comes along. And so there are these debates about what does the presence of the cross mean in Mi'kmaq communities. Does this a symbol of Christianity, or is it a dragonfly?
Wow.
Or both?
Yeah. It doesn't matter. I guess that's why and I know we're running short on time, but this question keeps coming up to me. I'm like, and maybe it's just, because it's on the surface of everything I'm doing right now. And I think you'd have unique insight. And I had this question come to me the other night about, can we decolonize indigenous history? Is there such a thing as decolonizing it, or is the only way forward? Is it can you subtract Christianity out of it, and it still is the history of these indigenous peoples, because Christianity is now part of their story, and so I don't know, is it possible to decolonize? What do you think?
Well, have you seen this book, Decolonizing Mormonism?
No.
Okay, so this is a book by Gina Colvin, a Maori scholar, and Joanna Brooks. It's an anthology. I write an article in it, and a number of other indigenous scholars do.
Wow.
And so we look at that question, and I think there are certainly decolonizing things that we can do. Okay, you could think of decolonization as a movement rather than, well, a destination. A destination would be pretty impactful on those of us who are predominantly European in our ancestry, right?
Right.
Okay, so what does that mean for us, right?
Right.
And there are scholars who say decolonization is not a metaphor. They say that it's very literal. So a literal decolonization would be a dramatic transformation, right? It'd be all the land back. What do you do with all the people? Well, that in indigenous traditions, there was an incorporation, an acceptance of bringing some foreigners in, right? So maybe not everybody has to go back to Europe, but what you end up with is not a truly decolonized society, but what my good friend Himoperiki Simon, he's another Maori scholar, he says the best that we can do is a post-colonial religion. We could create a post-colonial religion. It's not fully decolonized, but it's coming to terms with the colonization of our own history. And that's what I aim for here. I mean, decolonization is my goal, but I know I missed the mark by a long shot. But I hope I'm closer to a post-colonial reading of the Book of Mormon than is typical. And I do want to, before we close, I do want to remind your listeners that my book is now available at any major online bookstore. It's also available at Benchmark Books in Salt Lake City. I will be speaking there on Tuesday, June 9th at 6 p.m. I would love to sign your book, and definitely if you come up to me, mention the Church of Cory Hore, and I'd be happy to sign it there. I'm also going to be signing books at the Mormon History Association meetings in Las Vegas, Nevada. That will be the first weekend of June.
Cool. Hey guys, I want to thank Dr. Thomas Murphy for coming on. This was a last minute thing we threw together. We just talked yesterday for the first time, but I've respected you for a while now. Like I said, at first I said no. It was hard. It's been hard to accept, but there's been a paradigm shift here, and you've been at the forefront of it for a long time, a lot longer than I've been an atheist, and left the church and all of that. And to look back now and see that history, how long you've been in this and evolving, not only as a scholar but as a person, I have to tip my hat to you, sir. This has been a real journey for you, and I want to honor that. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. And I will acknowledge that I too didn't believe it, the idea that there was indigenous influence on Joseph Smith. And in fact, I was very skeptical of that idea. I initially approached it, and if you read my book carefully, you can kind of see this, right? As a reception history. This is the way that that Haudenosaunee communities have read the Book of Mormon. And it certainly is that. And people that are skeptical of the idea of the influence can read my book that way, because for the most of the time I was writing it, that was my perspective. As I was doing kind of the last or actually one of the first rewrites for the editors, they asked me to take a stronger stand on, because I was actually quite agnostic on whether or not there was direct influence on Joseph Smith. But when I had to really take a stand one way or the other, I drew back on that experience of indigenous ways of knowing as a scientist, doing work alongside indigenous knowledge keepers. And I gained such a deep appreciation of indigenous ways of knowing that I can't dismiss them. And I think that there is some substance to that. I don't think I've answered all the questions by any means, and the historical record is limited, so there is a limit to what we can say. But I think it's fair to say that the Book of Mormon is a product of Iroquois, the place of Iroquois. That is the place Iroquois places. It is a settler reading of indigenous traditions. It's not an indigenous tradition itself. And that's what I would say. And I would also do in Coast Salish culture, they teach us to raise our hands as a way of kind of thanking and acknowledging. I want to thank you for your time and for this platform. And I also, ironically, I know there's been a lot of heat towards David Taylor, and I'm skeptical of some of his. I think he oversells the Book of Mormon from my perspective, in terms of its historicity. I'm still doubtful of the historicity, but I want to raise my hands to him for raising the conversation about the importance of indigenous sacred records alongside the Book of Mormon, and the resistance that he's getting. I feel the same heat. Okay, I feel the same heat as well, and I'm taking it alongside him. So I see us as traveling parallel paths, but my approach is more academic, more skeptical. His approach is more indigenous, more in some ways. There's some stuff sometimes that some of his stuff gets a little more colonizing, but his approach is also more devotional than mine. And I think that's a legitimate way of approaching it. So I appreciate the work that he's doing as well.
Wow. It's big with him because I know it would be. He at first, this is the anniversary of the death of his son. And he's taking time off today, particularly right now. He's in Germany with his family. And I had a conversation with him literally an hour before this, and the last thing he said to me, I'm like, I gotta go get ready for my interview with Dr. Murphy. And he said, tell him and tell your audience, I think Dr. Murphy is right, at least that he is going in the right direction, and that it's nice to know that there's somebody in that academic world who has the respect to look into what we're saying and say at least know the facts about what we're saying, and that's all we're asking. And I thought, man, that's huge. You know, it'd be great. It'd be great for you two to meet sometime. I think, because I think you'd find that that you are kindred spirits coming at the same thing with different beliefs, but coming to similar conclusions, and it's interesting.
I suspect our paths will cross.
Sounds good. My friends, I want to thank Dr. Murphy, and we'll go ahead and close here with another one of our closing hymns. I could go full snarky since we're among, shall we say, progressive agnostic personalities, shall we say? And I want to thank Dr. Murphy. What shall we play? I'm going to wait. I'm going to look for something here. Where's my button? We got horror lyrics. Oh, I have a new one. We won't do that one, though. Let's do let's not do Hammers in Heaven. That one was very aggressive. Let's go ahead and do let's go with an oldie but a goodie. We got Cory Hore. In honor of our friend Cory Hore, we'll go with the anthem. Thank you very much, Dr. Murphy.
The flight director says get back.
My bad.